here, and the build-up, because we got a defect in the decarboxylase enzyme, which required pyridoxal 5-phosphate, P5P, to activate it to coproporphyrinogen. And the same thing applied when we have light exposure to light here. It goes on to form coproporphyrin, which again oxidizes oxygen or adds an electron on here in the presence of light at 400 nanometers. This is the one I find shows up mostly with migraines, because migraine people are very sensitive, aren't they, to light, especially, you know, on the retina of the eye. They get disturbances anyway with the zigzaggy. They get an aura sometimes of the light before, but if they get a flashing light, sometimes it's just trees with the sunlight behind, can trigger the migraine off. And I found sometimes often giving yellow compounds can be very relieving for them. They could be compounds like lutein, which strengthen up the back of the eye and absorb the blue pigments there because they're in the yellow. And another wonder substance, of course, in that same range there is turmeric. But we found earlier on, I thought, well, turmeric is the same color really as lutein, but it never worked. So I couldn't get turmeric to work. I thought, wait, why is this? Why does it not work as a yellow pigment to absorb it? And there was a very simple reason, and I wasn't using organic. As soon as I used organic turmeric, it worked a trait. It absorbs the violet end of the spectrum of the light there. And so the compounds within turmeric are only in organic and fresh turmeric. They're not in old. You'll notice that turmeric has a slight orangey color to it, and when it's old, it goes yellow. And so it's lost their particular active ingredient. So by the time you get an Indian meal with yellow rice, you haven't got good turmeric in there, I'm afraid. You probably got, certainly not organic. It should give an orangey color, slightly orangey color to the rice, not bright yellow. Okay. So here, if we've got a problem with these porphyrins, always challenge with the mauve acetate, which is 400 nanometers, if you are high in either of those two or suspect it, because these people are sensitive to light and would be wise to not only activate this pathway with the pyridoxal 5-phosphate, but to take lutein or other chromophobe absorbing compounds. So that's the 400 nanometers. So we're just into the early stage of the violet end of the spectrum. Now coproporphyrinogen becomes oxidized then to protoporphyrinogen. Again, if we get an inhibition there, we need pyridoxal 5-phosphate and B2. Protoporphyrinogen goes on to protoporphyrin here, which again is an oxidation enzyme, so it needs oxygen to come in. And whenever there's oxygen needed, we need B12 to be able to get it to the site. And you'll see here that we've got an inhibition, red inhibitions. Mercury inhibits this pathway here. So high levels of mercury will lead to a buildup of coproporphyrinogen, and high levels of fluorine. That's interesting, isn't it? And fluorine is especially present in pesticides here, will lead to a high level of protoporphyrin. So they're like blocks, if you like, or damming up from the inhibitory, the factors, the chemicals and the toxic metals that inhibit the enzymes from working. So protoporphyrin then goes on to what is called heme B. There are a variety of different heme substances, but the most important one is the heme B, because this one goes on to make the heme proteins, particularly hemoglobin. And as we found, it goes on hemoglobin, myoglobin, cytochrome C, cytochrome P450, catalase, glutathione, cystathione, etc. So this molecule contains iron in the middle and 4 pyrroles around. So this is an interesting, very complex structure, but it's able to bond on to oxygen in the process. Now here's the picture of George III, who was one of the probably the foremost people to, when people talk about porphyria, they think, oh, George III, something to do with iron, isn't it? That's all I knew. Was it high levels of iron? What was it? And then it's only when I recently opened the book, also a year ago, to study about porphyrins that I realized, no, it's not iron, it's a lack, in fact, of it, because you've got these high levels of these reactive intermediate substances. Studies done in 2008 show King George had high arsenic in his tissues. So there was another part. So it could be that the arsenic was poisoning the enzyme, inhibiting the enzymes from being able to convert the porphyrins. So you would have a build-up of the porphyrins. This is probably the likely cause. They used a lot of arsenic in medicines in those days. Small doses, of course, but if small doses were used in slightly larger amounts, they could be toxic. Could be within food or water ingested. They know that the water pipes in Windsor Castle were very high in lead, but we don't know about arsenic. Or what was generally accepted is perhaps there was an attempt to poison him over a period of time. Other people who evidence seems to indicate have porphyria and who have mental problems as a result of this are Van Gogh, Maurice Utrillo, who was a sculptor, Beethoven, Mozart. I think everybody agrees Mozart probably was a Pyrrole or porphyria. No question about that. Genius that he was. John Nash, the mathematician, I think he recently died, didn't he? Just recently. Napoleon. Again, interesting, they found a high level of arsenic in Napoleon. There were an autopsy later on, which they think was perhaps due to attempts on his life. Camilla Claudel and Adolf. Adolf was quite an insane man. Probably made sensible decisions in his bunker, but not outside. But we should have kept him. We should have kept him in the beach sunbathing instead of. But look at those eyes, aren't they? Look at those. The two eyes. See where he's coming from there. If you ever did the digital photography course, you can see this left eye being the one that's looking at you, and this one's dead. That one's got no life in it at all. This one is where he's piercing. So he's left brain for sure. And Robin Williams was probably a porphyria as well. Went into deep depression. One of the more happy and joy to everybody in the world more than almost anybody else, and yet didn't have any for himself. Isn't it amazing? So a lot of alcoholics and addicts are related with porphyria, and of course a lot of them are related to P5P, B1, B6, all the things that we found improve the production of heme would be deficient. So heme is made in every cell in the body, especially the liver, bone marrow. 40% of heme that we make goes to making cytochrome P450, which is to detoxify. So that's an enormous amount of the heme. Steve Rochlitz hypothesized that chronic multiple chemical sensitivity patients have defects in their blood-brain barriers and often have hidden heart defects, particularly patent ovale, and are associated with this issue. Foramen Ovale, patent ovales, may be more common than what we imagined, which is the transfer of venous blood into the aorta part here, into the left atrium. So you're getting the shunting. Traditionally you get the blue baby, but this may be a hidden problem in more adults than what we imagine. So Alzheimer's disease has been linked to porphyria. We don't know for sure whether porphyria is part of the syndrome. But an interesting fact here, in 2004, some 4.5 million Americans were said to have the disease. By the age of 85, 1 out of 2 Americans. And that is terrifying, isn't it? Yesterday we discussed the fact that if you make it to 90, though, in America, you probably haven't got Alzheimer's. You don't tend to get it. If you make it a certain age, this is an in-between disease. So hemoglobin is composed of iron and from the heme and globin proteins. We'll work through those because they're academic. Myoglobin is muscle-stored oxygen. So myoglobin is very similar, it's just different amino acids to hemoglobin. And the newly identified neuroglobin accounts for the nerve cells taking oxygen. So these globins are basically proteins which absorb the oxygen and transport it to the area where it's needed. Oxygen, nitric oxide, and carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide bind to the iron atom in heme proteins. So we can lose the oxygen. We know what happens sometimes is that carbon monoxide gets locked on, and it's called methemoglobin because it loses its ability to carry oxygen. So the presence of hydrogen sulfide and nitric oxide can displace this. Myeloperoxidase we've seen here. Myeloperoxidase is a peroxidase enzyme and is most abundantly expressed in neutrophils. Myeloperoxidase has a heme pigment which causes its green color in secretion rich in neutrophils. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Because this brings us to the work that we discussed yesterday with the different colors. So what you've got is people who develop or go on towards making hyperchlorite tend to have problems of weakening with the green color. from a biophoton point of view. Thyroid peroxidase we talked about puts the iodine onto tyrosine at this point so that we actually can make the T4 in the first place. Now, Pyroluria, we hear a lot about this, especially from America and Australia. It's known by many different disorders: Pyrrole Disorder, Kryptopyrrole, Kryptopyrroluria, etc., Pyrrole Disorder, Mauve Factor. Pyroluria can best be described as the abnormal synthesis and metabolism of haemoglobin. It's probably more accurate to call it hydroxycobalamin 2,1, HPL, is the real pyrrole which they measure. It's a metabolite which was originally thought to be Kryptopyrrole, but it's actually an isomer of it. So this is considered to be HPL is the Mauve factor. And it's called the Mauve factor because you see this in the urine. So this is when the urine goes mauve in people. The discoverer of the mauve really was Abram Hoffer back in the 1950s. He discovered this with the problems related to adrenal problems. A lot of Abram Hoffer's work is now being looked at again more seriously. Particularly, he didn't have the analysis of adrenochrome and adrenoleukin, which were substances he identified from the metabolites of adrenaline and serotonin. We now know what those substances are in their relationship to schizophrenia. So he was one of the first to recognize that mauve in urine was not a good idea and that it led towards psychiatric problems. Let's move on from that. So Carl Pfeiffer in the 70s then took this up and said that mauve disorder, in other words, problems with pyrroles and porphyrins, lead to spots on the nail. Well, that's mainly zinc, I think, spots on the nail often. Stretch marks, people who get stretch marks, that's the elastin doesn't recoil. Pale skin, why? Because they don't like the sunshine, as we've already discussed. Poor tanning, because they haven't got the sensitive. Knees and joint pains, constipation. Poor dream recall, this again is a sign of B6 deficiency. Morning nausea, again typical of B6 deficiency. Sensitive to light and sound, they become hypersensitive. Odor intolerance, this is multiple chemical sensitivities. Migraines, as I said, with the porphyrins, and stitches in the side. Later on, two other workers in the field said low stress tolerance, anxiety, often overly pessimistic the people become, which is why perhaps they become alcoholics and addicts very easily. Can have explosive anger, hyperactivity, socially withdrawn. Interesting concept, hyperactivity and socially withdrawn. They're almost opposites, aren't they? But sometimes these people have both qualities. Emotionally labeled, loss of appetite, and easily fatigued. So, abnormal fat distribution, they tend to get a ring around in the abdomen. Irritable bowel, delayed puberty, irregular menstrual periods, overcrowded teeth, joint pains, reading difficulties, motion sickness, auditory, processing disorders, memory loss, and insomnia. Apart from that, they're pretty good. It doesn't mean that every case of Pyroluria or porphyrin has these, but they have, there's a few more here. So sugar cravings, poor morning appetite, that's an interesting one, isn't it? They don't like breakfast. Frequent infections, allergies, impotence, sweet breath and body odor. This is usually because acetone and other chemicals are coming out. Paranoid seizures and intolerance to bright lights. That's more of a good amount. So they're often gluten sensitive, but I think we want to leave this part out because I think it's probably not gluten, it's probably oils, the wrong type of oil, because these people need good quality omega-3s and omega-6 oils. I think it's the rancid wheat germ oil, which means it hasn't got any vitamin E left in it, and the oils within the wheat germ have then gone rancid. So I think it's the taking in of rancid oils within the bread that they eat. Steve Rochlitz has actually written a very interesting book, which if you're interested in porphyrins, I learned a lot from. It's called The Ultimate Porphyria, the Ultimate Cause of Common Chronic and Environmental Illnesses with Breakthroughs in Diet and Supplements. If you copy this website down, because I don't think this is probably in there, but if you just copy that down and go to that website, there's a talk. You can give this out as a link to your people, hopefully with your recommendation to order my book. So I found his book very interesting, learned an awful lot about Pyroluria and porphyrin. So what I would do is I'd go to that website and you can hear a talk about it for an hour, all about porphyrins. So wellatLast.com, testimonials, HTML. Okay, so I'll go on from there. So other causes of anemias. We've talked there of not getting enough heme, and basically the deficiency of heme indicates a deficiency of B12 and a deficiency of iron. So the three types of B12 that may be needed for a body is hydroxycobalamin, which is basically just B12, adenosylcobalamin, and methylcobalamin. B12 is a water-soluble vitamin which functions mainly in the brain, the nervous system, and formation and maturation of the red blood cells. One of its functions also is to is normally involved in the metabolism of every cell in the human body, especially DNA synthesis and regulation, but also fatty acid synthesis, and especially it helps to prevent odd chain fatty acids like propionic being formed and to help burn those up in the Krebs cycle. So B12 is only formed by bacteria. Well, no animal product, although it's rich in B12, actually makes the B12. Okay, B12 is not normally made from plants, but it's made by bacteria in the colons, in the gut of animals, and particularly ruminants. So it is only made by bacteria, B12. Now, the fascinating thing is that the mitochondria is a self-contained unit within the cell. So we have a cell which works fundamentally anaerobically through glycolysis, and then we've got this added powerhouse inside which works aerobically and produces 9 times more energy than glycolysis. And this inner mitochondria contains its own DNA, and the DNA in there is circular rather than spiral, like in nucleus DNA. And this is exactly the same style of or shape of DNA as a bacteria. So the theory is that at some stage in primitive life, not in our generation, but before even we were ever thought of as far as mankind, that the Earth had a large content of methane gas. And then when plants came along and produced oxygen in the process of photosynthesis, gradually the oxygen levels rose. And this meant that the bacteria, the simpler form of life, had to change their form and become oxygen imbibing rather than methane. And we don't know where the methane presumably came from volcanoes and things. And at one point, a critical point when the oxygen levels rose and the methane levels decreased, the aerobic bacteria, which had converted into oxygen breathing, entered into the weakened anaerobic bacteria, which were weakened because oxygen levels were rising and methyl was going down, and they entered into that and became a parasite. So you had, instead of a single cell anaerobe, you then had a single cell anaerobe with an invader inside, and the invader is the mitochondria. So that oxygen-loving, very, very small little bacteria invades the bigger one, and that's what we have in our cells today. That's the theory. And it's quite interesting because the DNA encodes in the mitochondrial DNA encodes exactly for the proteins, i.e. the enzymes, that run the mitochondria. So everyone in there actually runs itself. So when we've got a mitochondrial problem, we now know that we can go in and test each of the pathways in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport and find out what those substances are. And they're now becoming more and more interesting that there's certain hereditary diseases which only occur when the caps come off the genes, in other words, demethylation occurs. And these are often inherited diseases too, with chronic mitochondrial dysfunctions. We were talking about Leber's disease, which is an inherited visual problem, and Parkinson's disease, and possibly other neurological problems are related to mitochondrial DNA faults. So these may be toxins which have got into the DNA and caused aberrations, oxidative stress, of course, and deficiencies. But we know that the DNA encodes for the proteins, but there could also be deficiencies of amino acids or deficiencies of specific coenzymes within the mitochondria, like pyridoxal 5-phosphate, like thiamine pyrophosphate, etc. So it's a very interesting concept that the mitochondria is a separate, and it's a self-contained unit. So when it damages itself because it blows itself up with oxidative radicals, it can actually repair itself, providing it's got the DNA polymerase, which is the zinc enzyme, to start the process off. So one of the first things I tend to test with people who've got energy problems is, do they strengthen to DNA polymerase? If they do, I know the problem's in the mitochondria. Okay, that's the quick way. So by testing with DNA polymerase, you know that they've got DNA damage, and that damage will be caused ultimately by oxidative problems. And after the oxidative problems comes the damage, and then comes the other chemicals of inflammation. So I'm going to skip this because this is related to B12 and methylation. I want to get on to the last topics, really, is to look at a couple of nutrients which are significant clinically. So I might be jumping on a few pages here. Right, so I'm not sure, has anybody found out what page vitamin D is on? 72. Okay, good. Right, so we're going to need let's tidy up here. I want somebody who's got a hormone or thinks they've got a hormone imbalance of some form. Okay, Finn, let's take you. Right, so you pop yourself down and let's see. So because of Fenn's height, I would think he's a green. We'd be surprised if you were blue, wouldn't we? So let's bend that one up to here, and you pull your knee to your shoulder there. Okay. Now let's pop that on there. Yeah, so we're a green. So we can turn you into wheat. This most simply using the grain. Now, what we want to do is to take the pain in the pain and diagnostic kit, which is a very useful kit to have. If we could just show me that one. The pain diagnostic kit is so cool because the first row of substances, or test substances, are the neurotransmitters. So these help us with identifying when the meridian is imbalanced, that the meridian is associated with high or low of the neurotransmitters. The second column is the main hormonal glands in the body. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through this with Finn. So what I want you to do is to hand me one at a time. So from weakness, I want to see if he strengthens to any of the following hormones. Now, there's probably no order, and it doesn't really matter. We're not going to start at the pineal and work our way down to the testes, or the testes up. But so just start at the top. Yes, just anyone, the top one. So we're going to go gallbladder. Now, some of these you'll say, well, that's not a hormone, but it's an important organ because it stores bile. Heart. The heart has now been found to be a hormonal tissue. It secretes oxytocin, noradrenaline, and dopamine. Right, very important. So we're looking to see if he strengthens to any of these. This will give us a chance to know what's going on. Right, eyes. Okay. So eyes. secrete a number of neuropeptides behind the eye. Practically all neurotransmitters are expressed in the eyes. Adrenal medulla is definitely more adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine. Lung, liver secretes hosts of enzymes, and testes produces testosterone, but it also produces progesterone and small amounts of estrogen, even in the boys. So we're right there. Spleen, very much related to the erythropoietic system, in other words, the recycling of red blood cells. Thymus, involved with thymosin, all the 3 or more hormones associated with differentiating white blood cells. Yeah, we don't want uterus. Parathyroid regulates calcium metabolism. Thyroid regulates metabolic rate and growth in children and growth and repair in adults. Okay, so let's not forget that. It's involved. We always think, oh, it's in growth in children. Children who are stunted with low thyroid are called cretins because they have low levels of growth and repair. But in fact, it's the same thing. It's involved with growth and repair in adults as well. What was that one? Thyroid, yeah. Pancreas, involved with insulin and lipase, of course, pancreatic enzymes. Kidney, involved with renin, angiotensin, activation of vitamin D. Adrenal cortex is all the steroid hormones, more or less the same as his testes, but in greater amounts of the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids and DHEA. So we've got that one, so we'll keep that one, adrenal cortex there. Pituitary, the master gland, so that one's all right. Prostate, well, definitely a secretory gland and very important, so that's positive. And the pineal, which is, of course, the major one involved with melatonin and other hormones to help us to sleep. So do you have sleep problems? Yeah. A little bit, did you say, or a lot?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah, tell us about them.
Just stay up a bit late.
He stays up late?
Yeah, trouble getting to sleep.
Trouble getting to sleep?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, so that's why you stay up late, isn't it? Because you're not ready for bed. But it's difficult. If you not feel tired when you go to bed, it's tempting not to go to bed, because there's no point in going to bed and just lying there, is there? No. So you go to bed when you're really ready to go to sleep. So we've got 3 come up here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to test him with vitamin D. Why? Because vitamin D is a hormone modulator. So if we can go back, Gary, to the chart. So vitamin D itself is called cholecalciferol.